Okay, so what substance is embedded in the cell walls and supports the stem of a plant? Lignin. Hey, 1 mark for that. What structures control water loss from leaves? Okay, guard cells I'll accept because they're part of the stomates. Okay, so we'll go with that. Okay, the reason I won't accept cuticle is because it doesn't control water loss, it prevents it entirely. Okay, the stomates, because they can open and close, have more of a controlling influence than the cuticle does. Okay, number 3, a root system that spreads out far but not deep is a fibrous root system. All right, a single deep root is a, Kennedy, taproot. Okay, the sugar produced by a plant is transported in the, okay, here, phloem. Okay, number 6, blank pressure is produced in water vacuoles and helps support a plant. Please. Turgor. Okay, in the leaf, photosynthesis occurs mainly in the palisade layer. Okay, in the leaf, water is stored in the spongy layer. And 9, we'll be out of 2 marks. Okay, the behaviors of water are cohesion and adhesion. All right, give them a mark out of 10. Let them see it. Make sure your name's on it. Put it in the box. Okay, so looking at factors that affect plant growth. So let's quickly brainstorm here. What are some things that might affect the growth of a plant? Sunlight. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and don't cheat by looking ahead in your notes. Water. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, temperature is a big one. Absolutely, altitude affects it, yep. Okay, mostly because higher altitude will change this, which will change the availability of water. Okay, I mean, there's lots of water on the tops of really tall mountains, but it is completely inaccessible for plants as they cannot absorb ice. Okay, so certainly altitude plays a factor there. Anything else? Okay, landscape they're going on, so soil, quality of the soil, like if it's rocky, sandy, clayish, okay, those kind of things. Absolutely. I'm going to call that other organisms, because it might not just be other plants, although that could be a problem, okay, because plants all have to compete for the same resources, but there could be predatory animals, herbivores, who come along and eat them. Okay, what else? Yeah, air quality could certainly be one. Okay, plants are often very sensitive to the concentrations of certain gases, okay, or things like acid rain. And that doesn't necessarily have to be precipitation acid rain. It could even be acidic mist. Okay, there are a lot of places where if it gets foggy, the mist contains a lot of nitric acid, sulfuric acids, things like that that are absorbed from pollutants in the air, and it can actually cause damage to trees. Okay, to trees and statues and things like that. If you actually go to some places in Europe, in the very old churches and castles and stuff like that, the gargoyles have no faces anymore, and okay, and the statues of saints are all completely eroded from acid rain because most of them were carved from limestone, and that reacts very quickly to acid rain. So, okay, things like that. Certainly, I would say that's a pretty good list of things. Now, what we need to look at here is, do some of these, kind of like what we did with temperature, right? Like altitude affects temperature, which affects water availability, okay? Sunlight can also affect temperature to a degree, okay? Can water affect soil? Certainly it can. It can erode it, okay, or it can make it very fertile. It depends what it's run through on its way there, okay. Other organisms, basically affected by all of this stuff, okay. The presence of other organisms is, well, there'll be animals around if there's something to eat, okay. If there's enough soil and nutrients, there'll be other plants around to compete with, right. So we have to look at kind of interrelationships here a little bit. Rarely is one thing going to decide the nature of an area. It can, in some cases, we would call it a limiting factor in that case, but in most cases it's an interaction of all of these things together. All right. So we need to break these things up into essentially two categories. The two categories are abiotic components, and that would be the things that are non-living, and then the biotic components, that is the things that are living, right? So most of the stuff we listed were abiotic components. They were things that are not alive, sunlight, water, soil, okay, stuff like that. Biotic components would simply be all the other organisms, plants, animals, insects, well, insects are animals, I guess, fungus, okay, bacteria, things like that that are around that can influence the environment in some way. All right, so we've got things here like sunlight. Sunlight's important because without it, there's no photosynthesis. Also, it does influence temperature to an extent. I mean, we know that in the wintertime, it can be bright and sunny. You look out the window, you're like, oh, it's a bright sunny day. You walk outside, it's minus 40. Okay, like some of our coldest days are actually clear sky, sunny days, because that's usually what you get when a cold front comes in, okay, is that wickedly cold, clear sky. Okay, so sunlight doesn't always dictate because things can affect the quality of your sunlight. For example, the tilt of the Earth. Right now, the Earth is starting to tilt towards or away from the sun, for us anyway. It's starting to tilt away. That's what causes the seasons, right? Okay, on the fall and spring equinoxes, Earth is straight up and down. Right? That's why we get 12 hours of sunshine and 12 hours at night on those 2 days of the year. Every other day of the year, it's slightly more, slightly less. Right now, we're heading to the depressingly less side, okay, of that equation, okay, until December 21st, when the Earth will be tilted 23.5 degrees for us away from the sun, for the people in Australia and New Zealand towards the sun, okay, and it'll start going back the other way. Right? Now, it's not that the Earth actually does this and wobbles back and forth. It's just that it sits like this all the time. But as it orbits the sun, if the table is the sun there, okay, as I come around the sun over here, okay, now in the summertime, we're tilted towards the sun, okay, and we get all that extra daytime sunlight, and the sunlight's more direct, okay, so we get better quality sunlight. So sunlight can be influenced by where you are on the Earth. If you're close to the equator, it doesn't really make much difference that the Earth is tilted because you're facing the sun all the time. Okay, but as closer you get to the poles, the more obvious that tilt becomes. Okay, we got precipitation. Okay, if you're in a very dry area, then there's going to be less plant life because there's not going to be frequent watering. The soil that you have influences how much of that water gets absorbed and how much of it runs off. And if it gets absorbed, how much of it can actually be released to plants? There's different soil types. Okay, sandy soils typically dry out really quickly. Okay, and clayish soils stay wet for a long time because they don't release the water. It's actually just as difficult for a plant to grow in clay as it is in sand. Right? They both actually dry out because the plants can't pull the water out of the clay. It holds onto it too tightly. So the best soil is loam. Okay, if you've seen that pile of screened loam over just to the west of the Air Ranch, okay, it's Dirt Cheap, that company Dirt Cheap, yeah, okay, anyway, they got the big pile of dirt over there, okay, and they have this big screener that screens it, and it's nice and black when it comes out of there. That's loam, okay, that's the good stuff for plants to grow in. Okay, within the soil, obviously we have the other organisms. Okay, those would be a biotic component. Where does soil come from? Two places, actually. It's probably not something you ever thought of. Dirt's just always been there. Okay, but dirt comes from two places: the erosion of rocks and the litter from plants and animals. And I don't mean that plants and animals are throwing garbage everywhere. I mean like when they die, okay, their body material, whatever, or if it's a tree every year it loses its leaves, that's litter. All right, it becomes humus, it decomposes, and it releases the nutrients that were in it before. Okay, so the buildup of soil is a very slow process. Okay, if you ever go high up in the mountains and start walking from the top of the mountain down, you can kind of see the soil building process in action. That is, near the top of the mountain, there's no soil. It's just what? It's just rock. Okay, but the further down you go, the longer that rock has been exposed from underneath glaciers and things like that. And so the rock is more broken. The further down you go, the particles get smaller, soil starts to accumulate because water will carry it downhill every spring when the runoff happens, and it collects. Okay, so the further down the mountain you go, the more complex the plant life gets because the more complex the soil is getting. Okay, so it's older and older the further down the mountain you go. The closer to the top, the younger the soil is because, well, the glaciers just receded from those areas. Or if you go into the ice fields, the glaciers haven't receded yet and there's nothing growing up there. Everybody follow? All right. So that covers some of the stuff there. Okay, we'll go over them in detail here. So probably the most important abiotic component, believe it or not, is temperature. Okay? Yeah, a plant can't live without sunlight. I give you that. But it also can't live if it's frozen. Okay, so an important factor because of its effect on biological processes and because most organisms cannot regulate their body temperatures. Okay? Mammals and birds are essentially the only animals who can regulate their body temperature. Plants have zero ability to do that. Right, so if it's minus 40 outside, the plant's minus 40. Okay? It has no metabolism that will cause heat and keep it going. All right, so plants are affected by temperature. They become too hot, they lose too much water, they shut down. Okay, they become too cold, ice crystals can form in their cells and rupture the cells. Okay, and enzymes can break down. This is kind of what happens if you get really severe frostbite. Okay? If you get really severe frostbite, ice will form within your cells and it'll rupture the cells, and your skin, when it thaws, essentially turns to goo. Okay? If you've ever seen someone who's gotten frostbite really, really bad, like their fingers just turn black, okay? And they essentially just fall off. They can become gangrenous. It's actually quite serious. So if you get ice crystals forming, remember that ice expands. It's bigger than water. And if you've ever seen ice crystals, they're full of really sharp edges. Okay? So they can easily rupture cells, including plant cells. So if you've ever seen what happens to a tomato plant after the first frost, okay? Anyone grow tomatoes? Right? Okay, but if you have, the first frost, the first time it gets even close to freezing, okay, the tomato plants are toast. And the next morning after that frost melts, they're just limp and dead. Okay, because in every single one of their cells, ice crystal forms, ruptures the cell, and the cell's fluids just leak out. There's no turgor pressure, water vacuole is toast because that's the thing that froze, okay, and the whole plant is dead. Many plants have an ability to resist freezing to a certain extent, but it isn't because they can control their temperature. It's because they'll secrete salts into the water vacuole to make it kind of an antifreeze. It'll only work to about -2, okay, -3 for most plants. So you can probably, if you have a garden, you notice like carrots will last until like mid-October, okay, but other plants won't. Okay? They just can't tolerate the frost. Okay, now, water. It's essential to life. Yes, we probably already knew that. Okay, but its availability varies drastically from place to place. Okay, believe it or not, a place like the prairies where we live is actually a relatively dry place. All right. Yes, there's water. It's available, but it's not everywhere. Right? It's not like being in the rainforest where if you were thirsty, you could just stand in one spot, open up your mouth, and I'm sure it would rain enough there, okay, for you to not be thirsty anymore. Right? But around here, that's not the case. You would have to find a river or a body of water, which are not necessarily everywhere. Right? If you were to go to certain parts of Ontario or certain parts of Quebec, there's a lot more freshwater lakes and things like that kind of hanging around. Okay? They're a much wetter place than here on the prairies. Okay? You go higher up in the mountains, same idea. It starts to get too cold. You don't have liquid water available. Okay? All right. Sunlight. Got to have that. Plants need it. It can't carry out photosynthesis without it. Okay? And it is the source of energy that provides energy for all living things. Okay? Even though we are not photosynthetic, we still depend on sunlight for energy. Okay? Because we either eat plants or we eat the organisms that ate the plants. And as a result, we are indirectly consuming solar energy when we eat. Okay? By that same logic, if someone ever gave you a hard time about, using up fossil fuels and things like that by driving a big truck, you could tell them that your truck is solar powered. Because really it is. That's where the energy in your gasoline came from. It is a fossil fuel, a remnant of photosynthetic organisms from many hundreds, millions of years ago. That'll probably shut them up for a little while. Okay? Yeah. I mean, really it is. Okay. Okay, so all energy that we use, okay, is indirectly or directly coming from the sun. All right, and light influences the behavior of plants and animals. Okay, plants understand when winter is coming, and they understand it not because it's getting colder. Right? We've had a pretty mild fall, and we had a pretty mild fall last year as well. Right? Plants could have very easily kept their leaves a lot longer, but they never do. They lose their leaves at the same time every single year because they are cued by the length of day. Okay? Photoperiod is what cues almost all seasonal changes for plants and animals. Okay, so if we're looking at plants, they understand that the amount of photosynthesis that they're carrying out is decreasing. Okay, and that's because there's less and less sunshine every day. When it gets to a certain point, that's when they signal for their cells to start producing certain chemicals that will cause the destruction of chlorophyll, which will then cause the leaves to fall off and the plants to go dormant. Okay, lots of the development of flowers and fruit, that happens during the longest days of the year because that's when the most energy is available for those kind of energy intensive endeavors for a plant. It takes a lot of photosynthesis to make fruit because there's a lot of sugar in it. If we're talking about animals, okay, mating periods and cycles and things like that are cued by photoperiod for many animals. Okay, most animals, if they're going to experience a long winter, they mate in the fall. Okay, and why would they do that? Especially mammals. It'll be spring, exactly. Okay, you want to have your young when you are going to be most able to feed them. Okay, and you are not going to be most able to feed your young in the winter time. Okay, so most animals, okay, will either, depending on how long they're going to gestate their young, that is how long they're going to be pregnant. Okay, that's what will cue their cycle so that they can have their young at the right time of year. Okay, if we're looking at simpler organisms that maybe just fertilize eggs, like fish, for example, some fish spawn in the spring, some fish spawn in the fall. It all depends on how long are their eggs going to develop. Okay, and then when can they hatch and have enough food to eat. Okay, so all of that is dependent though on photoperiod. Okay, believe it or not. Okay, so it's a strange thing. Geese, same idea. Okay, geese migrate every fall, not because it's getting cold, because sometimes you see them, we get one of those wicked cold snaps and lakes start to freeze and they're still stuck there. Okay, and they're kind of wandering around looking at the frozen lakes and not knowing what to do. Okay, it's because the days aren't short enough for them to have left yet. Okay, they're not that smart. Okay, they leave when the days are a certain length and they come back when the days are a certain length. All right, questions on how that works? It's a weird thing, but it's true. Okay, wind. Here's one we didn't come up with. Okay, wind amplifies the effects of temperature and it can accelerate evaporation. Okay, we haven't had it yet, but we will soon. Okay, once winter comes, you start getting that report every morning with the weather called wind chill. Okay, the wind chill factor. Okay, the wind chill factor is basically how cold you feel because moving air causes water to evaporate more quickly, and as a result, robs you of energy faster. All right. So the stronger the wind is, the colder it's going to feel. Okay, because of that. Okay. Now with evaporation, obviously, moving air can evaporate more water because the air sitting above the soil evaporates, pulls in some water, and then it's moved away, and dry air replaces it. So water moves from high concentration to low concentration, just like anything else. Okay, if you have a constant supply of moving air, then you're going to dry things out quicker. We know that. We take advantage of it. If you have a closed line, it works better on a windy day. Okay, if you want to dry your hair more quickly, you use a hair dryer and you blow hot air across it, because moving air that's high temperature will dry your hair more quickly. Okay, a clothes dryer, same idea. You tumble your clothes, okay, and it blows hot air on them and vents the moist air to the outside, so it can bring in more dry air to dry your clothes more quickly. So moving air is going to dry things out more quickly. Okay, plants adapt to windy conditions by altering their shape. Okay, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but these little fir trees are growing in what are called a crummels form. They're actually bent right over. Okay, so normally a spruce tree would look like that. Okay, these trees have grown like this. Why would they only grow branches on that side and bend like that? Which is more aerodynamic, this or that? Yeah, the second one is more aerodynamic. And if you think about this, if I look at the tree from the top, so if I'm looking straight down on it, this tree, okay, looks like this from the top. Right? It's got branches everywhere. This one from the top looks like this. So the trunk, when wind comes in from this direction, creates a wind shadow behind it. So the branches don't get snapped off. Okay, so they grow naturally in that form to protect their foliage, okay, protect it from wind chill, protect it from breakage, abrasion by ice crystals, okay, during a blizzard. You've all had that experience, right? They get out there and you're kind of covering your face because the blowing snow hits you and it hurts. Okay, it's sharp. It's like being in a sandstorm sometimes. Okay, all of that is a protective feature, and it grows a lot kind of near the ground where the wind speed is slower. Okay, and then anything that's kind of up above the ground just grows and kind of dwarfs and bends over. Okay, in order to produce kind of a wind trap, okay, where they can be protected. Right? All of these things are just things that plants do naturally. You can see that on this side of the tree right here, okay, there's no branches. Okay, and that's not because they've been broken off. The tree just doesn't grow any over there. Okay, just naturally knows where to grow them, where they'll be protected. Okay, right, so wind, that takes care of wind. All right, rocks and soil. How would you describe that soil? What's that? Okay, there's a lot of rocks, pretty rocky. Rich or poor? Yeah, I mean, most of us, our instinct would be to say poor, but it would be dependent on what's going to grow there, right? For these little scrubby plants and grasses, it's not so bad, right? They don't need to have deep roots, and they don't have really huge demand for water, so they can survive in that area. Here's the problem. The shovel that I put in the ground there, okay, it's actually, there's a rock behind it that's holding it up, because that's as far into the ground as I could put it. It was solid rock underneath that. The soil was about this thick. Okay, is that soil young or old? Very young. Okay, and this is that process of soil building I was talking to you about earlier. Okay, you get rocks that start to break up. Okay, they break up because of a freeze and thaw kind of a cycle that goes on. Okay, ice melts, the water runs in the cracks of a rock, and then it freezes and it cracks the rock open. The rock breaks into smaller pieces. Okay, water runs over the rock, rocks tumble over each other and break down into smaller and smaller pieces. Okay, those little pieces start to collect in certain places. That forms a rudimentary soil. It's not very good. Okay, it's not very thick, but it's there. All right. As it starts to collect, some plants can live in it. It's got just enough nutrients and ability to hold water that these really hardy plants can survive there. And as they grow there, they grow roots into it, which keeps it in place. It can't run off. It can't erode because the roots will hold it there. And then every year, these plants die. They leave their litter behind, which accumulates and makes more organic material in the soil. The next year, their seeds grow in the same place. They grow over top of that, and the soil builds up. And you can see that some of the rocks look like they're starting to kind of get swallowed up by the plants. They are. Okay? That's how soil builds. But it takes thousands of years for that process to happen. Okay? That's why farmers are very concerned about soil erosion. They don't like to see a big cloud of dust come off of their field, right? Because they know that represents many, many years worth of soil building, and it's all blowing away, right? It's going to collect somewhere else, okay? On your car, on your windows, on your house, okay? Not places where it's going to do any good, right? So they're very concerned about that. Or if there's a big rainstorm and a bunch of water washes away a bunch of the soil, that's a big concern too, okay? They lose that soil, they lose those nutrients. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Right, so the better the soil is, the more complex the organisms that are going to live there. So the more complex the plants are going to be. The more complex the plants are going to be, the more complex the animals are going to be. Right, which is why a tropical rainforest has pretty complex plant and animal life. Right, there's lots of nutrients, there's lots of complex plants, so there can be more animals. Okay, what's it like on the prairies? We got fairly complex plant life or not as complex? I mean, it's complex, but it's not diverse. Okay, I mean, if you look out on the prairie, there's grass and about 3 different kinds of tree. Right, it's not very diverse. And then for the animals, well, it used to be a lot more diverse, but you know, there'd be like deer and moose occasionally. There used to be lots of buffalo, but not anymore. Okay, there's birds, there's gophers, coyotes. Okay, used to be wolves, but there aren't anymore. Okay, things like that. Okay, it's reasonably complex, but not very diverse, and that's just because of the plant life's not all that diverse, which can only support certain herbivores, that can only support certain carnivores, and so on. All right. Periodic disturbances. This is another one we didn't list. Okay. An environment and the plants and animals within it can be shaped by things that happen either intermittently or randomly. Okay. The random ones, those are just, there's nothing you can do about that. Plants can't really adapt to a volcanic eruption. Okay. Volcanic eruption happens, they're toast. Okay. But forest fires happen intermittently. Okay, almost predictably, really, okay, in a natural ecosystem. They're important. They help to cycle nutrients. And you don't typically see a forest fire happen in a healthy forest. You see it happen in an old forest. Okay, an old forest where a lot of the plants have died and they're just sitting around, half decomposed, dry as a bone. Right? Is fire important in an area like that? It is. We want it to come through there. Right? For this reason, if it doesn't, all you're going to have is a bunch of sickly dead trees, okay, sitting around doing nothing. Right? When the fire comes through, and we talked about this the other day, it can cause the seeds of certain types of spruce trees to be released from their resin-coated cones. Remember I was talking about that the other day? Okay? Without that, the cycle of life doesn't complete. Okay? Those seeds just sit there and these trees do nothing. Right? So in an area like this where a fire has gone through, okay, all the organic material that's in these trees has been burned off. Now a lot of it left in the smoke, but there's a lot of it as ash on the ground. Can ash readily be converted into soil? Yeah, pretty quickly. I mean, a lot of the process has already happened chemically by fire. Okay, so a lot of that will get turned into soil fairly quickly. And is the availability of other factors now increased that these trees are dead? Okay, they're not taking water out of the soil anymore. So if you're a young plant, you've got a chance now because you don't have to compete with these mature plants. And what else is there more of? Sunlight. But not so much that you get bleached out. Okay, that's an important thing. When lumber companies were first told that they had to start planting trees to replace the ones they cut down, it didn't go well. And not because the lumber companies weren't doing a good job of it. They were planting tons of trees, and it costs a fair amount of money, and it's really backbreaking labor. The problem was is that they were planting these baby trees in an environment where baby trees will not survive. Baby trees are supposed to be thriving and growing in an environment like this, where the parent trees are dead, but still standing, and as a result, giving them some shade. You plant a baby tree on a hillside with no shade, it just gets bleached. Okay? The sun just kills it. And they were losing 50% of the plants they planted. Okay? 50% of the trees they planted were dying off because they had no shade. Right? So what they've had to do is kind of use trees that are more tolerant of that, or they don't cut down all the trees. They do what's called selective logging as opposed to clear-cut logging. Okay, and then that enables there to be some shade for the plants to start their growth. Okay, does that sort of make sense? Okay, would a hurricane be a periodic disturbance? Sure it would. Yeah, a hurricane can definitely be a periodic disturbance. It can cause flooding, okay, and that flooding can redistribute nutrients. Okay, the water can carry nutrients from one place to another and redistribute them. Okay, flooding is an important periodic disturbance. We had it here a few years ago, right? And water, the rivers came up and over the banks, and what was in all that flood water? Lots of nutrients. I mean, if you had to do any cleaning from that flood, the muck that was there. Okay, did anyone help out with the cleanup? Like it was just this thick layer of silt. Okay, that was everywhere. Okay, it was absolutely everywhere. It was heavy and it was hard to move. Okay, and it was everywhere. This thick layer of silt. Well, that silt is full of nutrients. It's excellent growing material. Right? And so usually after a flood, you see this really huge blossoming of growth on the floodplains, okay, where all that silt gets deposited because there's a whole bunch of nutrients that are now available. Okay, tornadoes. Tornadoes are an important periodic disturbance because they usually blow down mature trees. Okay, and that makes it possible for younger trees to take over. Okay, things like that. Again, these all cause redistribution of the abiotic components we talked about: sunlight, water, nutrients. Okay, and that's why periodic disturbances are important. Okay, to cycle communities through. Now, a volcanic eruption, it depends what kind, actually. In Hawaii, a volcanic eruption is a community-ending event because it's flowing lava that cools and turns into solid rock, and it's a sterilizing kind of event, right? But something that's more of a, like Mount St. Helens, for example, okay, that's more of a pyroclast, so it spews out a lot more dust and ash and kind of particulates as opposed to liquid rock. And so when that ash settles, yes, everything that was there is dead, but it can recover more quickly, and there's been this nutrient-rich material deposited there that it can grow out of. Okay, you guys were too young to remember when it happened because you weren't born yet, but I remember when Mount St. Helens erupted. It was freaky. We lived just east of Lethbridge at the time, and it was July. Was it May? Anyway, it was summer, and my dad had to take out the snow brush out of the back of the car to dust the ash off of the car. Okay, and Mount St. Helens is in Washington. Okay, hundreds of kilometers away, and that ash traveled all that way. Okay. And I'm not meaning like he had to dust a little tiny layer of ash. He was dusting ash, okay, this much of it, off the car. Okay, it's weird. So that ash went everywhere, right? It provided a layer of nutrients over a widespread area. Okay. Now, it's the interaction, like we said before, of all these factors that makes a community what it is, right? When we talked about nutrients getting redistributed, there still has to be a decomposition process. That's what all these little things do. Okay? Bugs, bacteria, fungus, all that kind of stuff are all decomposers. They're the ones that turn the litter and humus into nutrients to help keep the cycle going. So they're really important. Okay? But sometimes we view them as pests and we try and get rid of them, and we don't realize just what kind of important work we're doing. All right? So we got wood roaches, and we got cicada nymphs, earthworms, which are always turning the soil over and kind of aerating it. Okay, snails are important decomposers, sow bugs and ticks and mites. Okay, slugs, carpenter ants. Anyone ever seen these? They're big black ants and they bite hard. All right, but they live inside of like dead trees, right? And they actually make like tunnels and stuff through the trees. You have to watch. Before you cut down a tree with a chainsaw, check to see if there are any ants crawling on it. This is the voice of experience talking. When I worked at a golf course in university, I got sent out to cut down some of the dead trees, and we cut through one, and I got halfway through it, and all of a sudden the chainsaw started blowing carpenter ants all over me because I got into where they were, into the nest in the middle of the tree. Okay, and so it's just, you're standing there with the chainsaw, and it's just blowing carpenter ants all over you. I was wearing shorts, so it was not good. Yeah, got bit like crazy. Okay, we had another one, we cut it down, didn't realize it was full of carpenter ants, had all the wood in the back. We're driving along, and all of a sudden, feel something crawling, and they were just all over us and biting us like crazy. So they're nasty, but they're important because they take wood from this form and make it much smaller. Okay, termites do the same thing. Okay, they make that stuff smaller so that these organisms can use it for food, and they can convert it into nutrients for the soil. Okay, sorry, I saw someone's hand go up. No. All right, so interactions are all important. Okay, fungus, same idea. They're going to decompose things, okay, for us and release it all. All right, uptake of water by plants. This is what a root looks like if you cut it. Okay, and so you're looking at it in kind of cross section here. Right, we got the epidermis, okay, that outer layer. Right, we've got the cortex, okay, and the cortex and the epidermis work together to create that osmotic pressure that will cause water to move from the soil and into the plant. Okay, and then you got the vascular cylinder. Okay, that's kind of where the xylem is. Okay, so this is kind of like, you know, it's not really phloem out here because there's not any sugar being produced out here. Okay, but the vascular cylinder is where the xylem kind of begins. The water gets into there, and then it's going to be pulled kind of up the plant. Okay, so water and minerals and salt enter the plant through the epidermis of the roots, and they cross the root cortex, okay, and they end up inside the xylem, okay, to be drawn up the plant. Okay, so most absorption of water and minerals occurs near the tips of the roots, not on the fat parts of the roots. Okay, why doesn't it occur on the fat parts of the roots? In which one would water have to travel farther? If you have a really, really thin root like this, and you're trying to get water to move into here and then kind of travel by diffusion, okay, or would it be easier to absorb water through here and have it travel into here through diffusion? Which one's going to be faster and more efficient? Yeah, the small ones right here, okay? Way better surface area to volume ratio on this than in here with all these really big cells, right? So once the water gets absorbed by these little root hairs, so if you look at a carrot, the bulk of the carrot, okay, the orange part of the carrot is not absorbing water. Okay, it's those little tiny white little root hairs that stick off of it. Those are the ones that are absorbing the nutrients and the water, okay, or the tip of the carrot, right, is doing that. The parts we typically cut off, right, because they're not sweet. Okay, they're just containing water, whereas the bulk of the carrot is where the sugars and stuff are. All right, so that's kind of the structure of it. Water can follow two routes to get into the xylem. Okay, one route is fast and one route is slow. Okay, if the plant is dehydrated, it's going to use the fast route. The problem with the fast route, water doesn't get filtered. So if there's anything in the water that's harmful, the plant's going to absorb it and it's going to get to the leaves. The slower route, okay, involves absorption through these little root hairs, and then the water actually travels through all the cells. Every time it travels through a cell, the cell membrane can selectively pull out things that are bad, okay, and that water would get filtered, but it takes a lot longer to travel by that process. The other process is that it travels in between all the cells. Okay, so it does this, and that's a lot faster because it doesn't have to travel through the membranes. It can travel between them, okay, and get there more quickly. Okay, so we call those the symplastic and apoplastic routes. The apoplastic route is the fast one, okay, that travels between the cells and gets into the xylem. The symplastic route travels through the cells, their membranes and their walls. There's little breaks in the wall usually. We showed those on the cell diagram. Someone asked what they were, and I told them they were called, well, I got to make that bigger. They were called plasmodesmata. And I said that plants can share stuff through these little holes in the cell wall. Okay, anyway, that's kind of how that works. It's part of that symplastic route. I don't know why that text box is so small up there. All right, so soil solution flows. Hydrophilic means water loving through the walls of epidermal cells and passes freely along the apoplast of the root cortex. Okay, so apoplast is basically the sides of the cells there. Okay, soil solution moves through them, or moves along them. Some of the water and solutes are taken up. Okay, now we want the solutes to get taken up by these cells because we need the solutes to stay there. Why do we need the solutes to stay in here? If the solutes stay in the water as it moves into the xylem, are we going to have a difference in concentration between the leaves and the roots? Well, actually we won't, because we're having the water evaporate at the leaves, leaving some salts behind. If we don't take the salts out of the water that's in the roots, there won't be enough of a difference between the roots and the leaves to draw the water up the plant. The other reason we want to take the salts out is because we need the salts to stay in the roots so we can start drawing water by osmosis out of the soil again. Okay? So the process of going through that symplastic route is also a process of taking some of the solutes, some of them, not all, some out of the water to enable that osmotic pressure to actually work. All right. That part I'm going to skip. I don't need to teach that anymore. Okay. The endodermis and epidermis. Okay, epidermis again is that outer layer. Okay, where we got the root hairs. Okay, you can see the xylem is in here. Okay, the phloem is just outside of the xylem, so the xylem is this really central core area. Okay, within the root, the phloem is a lot closer to the middle than it is in other parts of the plant, because it's essentially got to be in there and allowing sugars to go places as opposed to collecting them, which is what it does up in the leaves. Okay, now because roots do a lot of filtering of materials through the cells when they absorb water, herbicides that are absorbed through the roots typically don't work very well, okay, because they won't get absorbed. They'll get filtered out, which is why most herbicides, that's things that kill weeds, get sprayed on the leaves. They actually then get absorbed through the stomates. When the stomates open, the fumes from the stuff you sprayed get sucked in through the stomate with carbon dioxide, and then it kills the plant. It's much more effective to have them go in through the leaf. All right, plants can be essentially grouped into two categories: hydrophytes and xerophytes. Okay, the suffix phytes means, sometimes also written as philic or phile. It would mean hating or loving. Loving, yeah, okay. If you're a, this is awful, but you won't forget it. Okay. A pedophile loves children. Phile means, the suffix phile means loving, okay? And then whatever you put in front of it is what they love. Hydrophytes, hydrophiles love water, okay? Now you know how that works, okay? All right, if you are phobic, then you fear it or hate it, okay? So if you're a hydrophobe, you hate water or fear water, okay? There's all sorts of phobias, right? Okay, but we're talking about not so much psychological things as we are biological things. All right, so if you're a hydrophyte, you love or can at least tolerate very wet, even flooding conditions. Right? So lilies, water lilies are an example of that. Okay, their roots can be submerged, and they actually can absorb oxygen through their leaf, and that can sustain them. If you look at like big poplar trees and things like that, if their roots are submerged for any length of time, more than a couple of days, they die, because the roots can't absorb oxygen, they can't carry out cellular respiration, and the plant essentially suffocates. Right? So to be hydrophilic, okay, the plants need to have special ways to absorb oxygen to nourish their roots. Now, it's hard to see in this picture here any scale, but these are tropical rainforest plants. Okay, these are their underground roots. Okay, so they're kind of everywhere. There's lots of them. They got washed away by a flood. The dirt did, sorry. The roots are exposed here. So these are the ones that anchor them to the ground and do some absorption of water. But they need to have oxygen in order to carry out cellular respiration. The leaves can't absorb the oxygen and transport it down here. That's what these are for. Okay, these roots here, the guy who was giving us a tour, he called them snorkel roots. Okay, because that's exactly what they do. They're like a snorkel. for the roots. They absorb oxygen because they're high enough that they stay above the water line. They're tall enough because if I stood next to them at about 6 feet tall, I wouldn't be as tall as they were. Okay? They were between 7 and 8 feet above the ground. Okay? Now, you have to be. In a tropical rainforest, sometimes the floodwaters can be 5 or 6 feet deep. Okay? If you go to the Amazon rainforest, a lot of times from above, it looks like the forest is growing out of a big lake. Okay? Because the Amazon River floods all the time. That's what it does in tropical rainforests. And for a lot of them, their bottoms are submerged often. Okay? All right, so that's how they can absorb the oxygen. Okay? They love water. They love lots of water. They can tolerate that. Our plants are not hydrophilic. Okay? They're more along this, not this extreme, but along this area. Okay? Xerophytes. Okay? Zero means dry. Okay? They love dry conditions. Okay? So they can tolerate drought. They can tolerate high concentrations of salt, okay, that usually come with drought, okay, and things like that. They're usually heavily modified to prevent evaporation and to prevent grazing. Okay? That's why a cactus has thorns on it. Right? If you are a plant that's not going to get water very often, you need to store it in your tissue. But then you can't have things coming along and biting you, because if they do, the water will leak out, and then you'll die. So they have to have things that prevent people or animals from eating them. All right, so cacti have thorns. Okay, not too many animals can eat a cactus. Okay, the exception being antelope. Okay, antelope can actually chow down on a big old cactus. Okay, around here you get those prickly pear cactus. They're kind of I'm not going to try to draw it. They have approximately this shape, but they're covered in sharp thorns, but the thorns are really thin, and they break easily. Most things won't touch them, right? Like if a deer comes along and it tries to eat that, it'll get a thorn, okay, in its lip, okay, or in its tongue, or in its gums, or wherever, and it's very painful, and they usually have tiny little hooks that you can't even see on the end, and they stay in there, and they're really hard to get rid of. Don't ever let your dog get into it's nasty. Okay, if they ever get into a cactus, because man, they got to pull every one of those things out. They got little hooks on them. It's nasty. But antelope have a mouth and a tongue that's like shoe leather. Okay, they can just eat it, and the needles just break right off, and they just chow down on the cactus because their mouth is adapted to actually eat that stuff. Okay, but there's not many animals that can do that. So the thorns work for the most part. Okay, the thick cuticle, okay, so they have an extra thick cuticle, more than other plants would have, that protects them from evaporation. Their stomates are kind of more hidden. The way they carry out photosynthesis is different. They carry out part of photosynthesis during the day and part of it at night. Okay, that limits the amount of evaporation. So the parts of photosynthesis that cause evaporation, they do at night when the sun's not out. They collect the sun's energy and then they use it at night to do the energy demanding parts. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right, and again here about xerophytes. During the driest months, desert plants will often go dormant so that they don't have to worry about losing water while carrying out photosynthesis during a dry time. Okay, or they'll subsist on like fluid that's stored in their tissue. Now, sometimes people get this idea like, well, if I'm dying of thirst in the desert, I'm just going to go punch a hole in a cactus and water will come out. Except that that's not the way it works. Okay, it's not a thermos. Okay, it's not like a big jug of water inside. It's the tissue is almost like fruit. Okay, it's almost like an apple, right? If you ever cut open an apple, you can kind of suck the juice out of it. Okay, or an orange, you can kind of suck the juice out of it. That's kind of what a cactus is like. But you got to make sure you get the right cactus. Some cactus will make you really, really sick. Okay, and they're all bitter. Okay, they're not a good tasting. It's not like, oh, a refreshing drink of water. First off, it's not going to be cold because the cactus is sitting there in the sun. Okay, so it's going to be hot water and it's going to be bitter, and you're going to have to suck it out of the flesh. You're going to have to cut pieces of the cactus out, put them in your mouth, and suck the fluid out of it. So it's not I mean, you could survive if you got the right kind of cactus. You got the wrong kind of cactus, it'll make you sick, you'll vomit, you'll get dehydrated even faster, and you'll probably die. So you got to know which cacti are okay to do that with. Okay, so unless you're like Bear Grylls or somebody like that, okay, you got to know what you're doing. All right, I think that's it for that. Okay.